Hello everyone. As you may know, we're doing a series on when God says no, and that set me thinking, how do I react when somebody says no to me, especially if it's something I'm passionate about or care deeply for? I used to run a preschool for over 25 years. I'm a mother and a grandmother, so I have plenty of experience of what happens with small children when you say no. But if I'm really honest, some of those emotions that they feel, I also feel. Feelings perhaps of bewilderment or confusion, rejection even, or anger. It's just that as an adult, I hope I've learned to control them. But how do I react when it's God that's saying no? Today we're going to be looking at one of the most famous characters in the Old Testament, King David. And one of the occasions where he experienced God saying no. David was a king of Israel. He wasn't their first king. Their first king was a man named Saul. But Saul had turned his back on God, rejected him, and so God had anointed David as his successor. He didn't have an easy time though. Even before he became king, Saul tried to kill him many times. And David was forced to flee, a fugitive in his own land, fleeing into the desert and living in a cave. And even when he did become king, life was still not easy. The neighbouring tribes and nations kept raiding the people of Israel, waging war on them. But David was a brilliant military strategist, a warrior king, and he led his people in many battles before victory was gained. But we join him now in Jerusalem, newly conquered and now the capital of a united Israel. David is walking in his palace, thinking over all that has been achieved, all that God has enabled him to do. And as he looks across, he sees the tabernacle, a sort of very ornate tent in which the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord was housed. David's heart is filled with thanksgiving and praise to God, and above all he wants to honour him. And so we read, he had it in his mind to build a temple. This was not a new idea. The people had long wanted to do something of this nature. Perhaps based on a verse we read in the earlier books of the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, where we read this: "But you will cross the Jordan and settle in the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and he will give you rest from all your enemies around you, so that you will live in safety. Then, to the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name, there you are to bring everything I command you, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes and special gifts, and all the choice possessions that you have vowed to the Lord." And I can imagine that as David looked around and realised that the people were now settled in the promised land, and they did have peace on the borders, that he felt like it was the right time to honour God in this way. And so he asked Nathan the prophet, and was told, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." And I can imagine David full of enthusiasm, going away, picturing the temple in his mind, staying up late into the night, building plans, thinking about the logistics of building, what would be needed, where it would come from, how it would be done. And then the very next morning, Nathan comes back and tells David, God says no. Now David was just an ordinary human being like you or me, and he must surely have been very disappointed. But he didn't argue. Instead, we read that with absolute humility, he went straight into the tabernacle, bowed down in thanksgiving, praise and worship. In fact, I think that verses 18 to 29 of this chapter in Samuel are some of the most beautiful verses in the whole Bible. And Psalm 139, which is an expanded version of this, has to be one of the wonderful psalms. So how did David do this? I think the clue is in one of the descriptions of David, where he's described as being a man after God's own heart. Now, of course, that did not mean that David was perfect. He most certainly was not. He was a flawed human being, just as we all are. He went wrong. He made mistakes, some of them really drastic. But he never stopped loving God. He never stopped wanting to serve him. David's whole life was centred around doing God's will, wanting to obey him and glorify his God. This was the one thing he desired above everything else. So when God said no, that was all he needed to hear. And he fell down in worship. But why did God say no? To find the answer to that, we can see David's own words in another book of the Bible, the book of Chronicles, where we find David himself later declaring, "Listen to me, my fellow Israelites, my people. I had it in mind to build a house as a place of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord, for the footstool of our God, and I made plans to build it. But God said to me, you are not to build a house for my name, because you are a warrior and have shed blood." David was a warrior king, a brilliant military strategist. But it wasn't really appropriate for a warrior king to build the temple for God. David would always be associated with the battles that had been fought and won. God's temple was not to be a thanksgiving or a memorial to military victory, but a place of worship and peace. And it was to be David's own son, Solomon, a man of peace, who would build the temple. David's vision was not wrong. The temple would be built in Jerusalem, but not by David, and not then. Right idea, wrong time. Sometimes when God says no, it isn't because we've got it wrong, but because it simply is not the right time. It is not God's time. Back in the year 2000, Debworth Green Baptist Church burnt to the ground. And I can remember standing there the following morning with others, looking at the burnt out shell, and having a vision of a phoenix rising from the ashes, a new building. A few years later, we were invited to be part of something called the Big Project, a community project involving schools, libraries and the church. We got very excited and began to plan. Surely this was what we were to do. But it fell through. Effectively, God said no. It wasn't that our vision was wrong. It was just not God's plan and not God's timing. Happily, a few years later in 2010, we had the joy and privilege of opening a brand new building. God's timing, not man's timing. You know, one of the reasons I love this story of David is because of the gentle but firm way in which God dealt with David. He knew that David's intentions were good, but they were not in accordance with God's will. So God gently rebukes David, effectively telling him, I didn't ask you to build me a house. And then God graciously reveals to David his plans. In a wonderful play on words, he tells David, I didn't ask you to build me a house, but that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. David was the second king of Israel. He had no idea who would be king after him. But here God tells him that he will establish for him a dynasty, a name that will last. He tells him that his own son will be king after him, and his son after that. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. This was God's plan. This was David's legacy. And of course, ultimately, Jesus, God's own son, would be born of David's line. You can read the words of the angel in the book of Luke, chapter 1, where the angel tells Mary, Jesus' mother, "Don't be afraid, Mary, for you have found favour with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." And right at the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, chapter 22, Jesus himself says this, "I, Jesus, have sent my angel to give you this testimony for the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David, and the bright morning star." David's legacy was not to be a temple, but his name would be remembered forever. God's plan, not ours. There's a delightful appendix to this story, and we see that in later years, in his love and compassion, God gave David the plans for that temple. And David was able to make provisions for the building of that temple: the stone, the wood, the silver, the gold, and leave it to his son. Again, in 1 Chronicles, we read this: "Then David gave his son Solomon the plans for the portico of the temple, its buildings, its storerooms, its upper parts, its inner rooms, and the place of atonement. All this," David said, "I have in writing as a result of the Lord's hand on me, and he enabled me to understand all the details of the plan." David would never see the temple, but in his love, God gave him a glimpse of its glory. So when God says no, let's learn from David, and with our whole heart wanting to serve the Lord, let's bow in humility before him in thanksgiving and praise. Because in Isaiah it says this, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." So when God says no, let's go with his plan. Let's turn to God, place our hand in his, and follow him wherever he may lead us, confident that his way is the right way, his timing, not ours, his plans, not ours.